No one in the waiting room? So we're good?
Not at present.
Okay.
But I'll keep checking.
Okay, and I think we can start. Hello, everyone. I'm Tatiana Saburova, and I'm an academic director of the Russian Studies Workshop at Indiana University, funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And we also have, as a part of our Russian Studies Workshop here, we have Siberian Studies Working Group. So we try kind of to push a little bit Siberian studies because we think it's important. But also, of course, when we talk about Siberia, we cannot avoid, speaking of environmental issues, environment, nature, infrastructural projects, and of course, civil rights and human activism. So many really important questions we're going to discuss today, and we have just brilliant presenters. I'm so happy to have our four panelists here, three panelists and a moderator. And for the beginning, let me introduce our moderator and presenter. So our panel will be moderated today by Angelina Davidova. And Angelina is an environmental journalist, and she serves as a director of the German-Russian Office of Environmental Information. She served as UC Davis as a Humphrey Fellow during 2018-19 year, and was a past fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, Oxford University. We have our long-term friend and colleague, I would say, Susan Crate. She's a professor of anthropology, and I believe many of you know her pretty well, in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at George Mason University. She has been working with indigenous community in Siberia since 1988, and her current research has focused on understanding local perceptions and adaptations of Sahara communities in the face of unprecedented climate change, a research agenda that has expanded to Canada, Peru, Wales, Mongolia, and Chipsay Bay. She is an author of numerous articles and multiple books, and I'm especially happy that today she's going to talk about her just recently published books, Once Upon the Permafrost, Culture and Climate Change in the 21st Century, published last year by University of Arizona Press. Our next presenter, Pei-Yi, she's associate professor of history at Pomona College. She's a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union, and she's interested in how ideas about nature have been shaped by culture, politics, economic practices, and physical environments. Her first book, The Life of Permafrost, A History of Frozen Earth in Russia, in Russian and Soviet Science, was published by University of Toronto Press in 2020. And of course, we are looking forward to hear more about her studies of permafrost and her, I would say, recently published book. And our last but not least presenter, Charlotte Wrigley. She received her PhD from Queen Mary University in London in 2020, and her doctoral research is the intersection between human geography, environmental humanities, and Arctic studies. And she recently served as a postdoctoral researcher at the Laboratory for Environmental and Technological History at the High School of Economics in St. Petersburg, but she will begin a new position soon at the University of Stavanger. And Charlotte has a forthcoming book, so we have actually really good reason to talk about 3 books today. And her forthcoming book entitled A Discontinuous Earth, Permafrost and Extinction in the Russian Arctic, derived from her doctoral project. And now I'm turning all power to Angelina as a moderator. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, for this introduction and also the kind invitation for me to become a moderator of this wonderful panel. I very much look forward to our discussion in the next hour and 15 minutes. And we'll try to stick to the time that we have. And thus, I also ask all the panelists, please beware of the time. I would like to start this panel by sharing a few words and some information about my personal situation, as we're all aware of the current conditions and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which took place in late February. That war has deeply affected lives of many people, also people in this panel. And it certainly affected a lot of Ukrainians, but it also affected quite a lot of Russians, Russian journalists, Russian activists, and Russian scholars. So I was one of those Russian journalists who decided to leave Russia, who had to leave Russia. I spent some time in Turkey, and now I'm currently in Berlin. And I'm also currently a fellow with the program which is called Media for Cooperation in Transition. And I'll be staying here for a while. That was not an easy decision, but that was also not very easy times we lived through. And this framing of new conditions, this framing of war taking place in our region, on our planet at the moment, is also something which frames our panel today. And it's also something which frames our debate about permafrost studies, so about climate change, and about all further projects, be it scientific cooperation projects, but also projects aimed at, for example, mitigating climate change or adapting to climate change in permafrost conditions. And along with many other panelists of today who have been working for many years on the topic of permafrost, I've also been deeply involved with the topic, and I've also traveled to quite a lot of permafrost regions of Russia, and, for example, visited the Pleistocene Park, which Charlotte Wrigley will also be speaking extensively about in her input. And it is indeed that the current political conditions and current conditions of a situation when Russia invaded Ukraine also put a lot of scientific cooperation projects under big question mark. As you probably know, quite a lot of scientific cooperation projects of Russia with other countries, including the US, including the European Union, have been put on hold and are not taking place now. And also the really big question now, what becomes with environmental information and also scientific information of all major processes connected with climate change. For example, the situation with melting permafrost or melting glaciers or increasing sea level rise. Will we have access to this information? Will any kind of scientific cooperation still be possible? So this is only question number one. Question number two is obviously Russia, being the largest country in the world in terms of its area, is obviously a very important player in the global climate agenda. And together with the Russian Studies Workshop, I've been organizing, speaking, and moderating quite a lot of events which were connected with Russian climate and environmental agenda in recent years. And we've been following very closely all the trends which were happening inside Russia, but also in the area of international cooperation, say within the sector of climate policy and climate actions. So here, another really big question: what happens to climate agenda in Russia now? So far, not so much information is available, and also not all the trends are clear. From what we see at the moment is that a lot of environmental regulation is being rolled back in Russia, just at this very moment as we speak. From, once again, what we hear from the experts and what we read in media, Russia will probably put under questions its climate targets, including its target of greenhouse emission reductions under the low carbon development strategy, which was adopted in November last year. There are also quite a lot of further actions and further steps in easing out environmental regulation in the areas of industrial pollution, but also, say, transport sector regulations, emissions from transport sector, also regulation considering and affecting gas flaring, and a lot of other sectors. This is obviously all very worrying news, not only for Russia, but also for the whole world. On my side, I'll be following this trend, and I'm sure also all other panelists are also looking deeply into what will be happening in Russia. And in a way, within our panel today, we will try to take a look at both what is happening now, but we'll also try to look into the future. What kind of further cooperation can there be in the area of permafrost studies? What do we do further on with all the projects which have been running, all these projects which we have dedicated many years of our lives to? Where is the global climate situation going to? What are we to expect from the climate agenda in Russia? How can we continue doing climate research and climate-related projects, climate mitigation, climate adaptation projects in the area? So all of these questions are very important, and they're also very important for our panel. And I do hope to hear quite a few insights from our wonderful panelists with me today. As I usually said throughout the last years, the last 2 years of the pandemic, I've so much wished that we would be all sitting in one room next to each other. However, Zoom is still better than no communication at all. So very warm welcome. And I'll proceed with my first question to one of our panelists. And I would like to address Charlotte Wrigley. So Charlotte, I believe and I know about your vast experience on working on the subject, permafrost studies. We've also, while preparing for this panel, we had a conversation about the Pleistocene Park, and we also spoke about Nikita Zimov, one of the creators of the Pleistocene Park, which, as I've heard, and I've been communicating with him extensively in the last few days, was still building another fence for the park and for the animals. So can you tell us briefly about your experience of working on the subject of permafrost in Russia, and also maybe share a few ideas about future prospects, like what can happen in the area of permafrost studies following Ukrainian invasion and following the post-war situation? And maybe also another question to you to start the discussion and to give us a new framing to the discussion. Very often when we think about permafrost, we immediately think Russia. But permafrost is not only found in Russia, it also found, say, in Canada and also in some other parts of the world. So how would you say Russian permafrost studies differ from, for example, Canadian permafrost studies? So maybe these two questions to start with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angelina. And thank you for your introduction. I have also left Russia in the past couple of months, so I know how hard it is and how painful it has been to consider the future of both our work, but also the horrible situation and completely against the invasion of Ukraine, goes without saying. But to answer a really interesting question, I thought I'd just maybe set the scene of what the Pleistocene Park is as a permafrost thaw mitigation strategy, because I'm not sure everyone is aware of it. I've got a couple of slides that I can share here. Probably this won't take up too much time. Okay, so the Pleistocene Park, what is it? It's a permafrost thaw mitigation strategy in Arctic Yakutia. So I'm up here near the town of Chersky, and it aims to restore the prehistoric mammoth ecosystem that used to exist in the Pleistocene era, which supported a number of animals, including the mammoth, obviously, but also creatures like the woolly rhinoceros and other sort of large herbivores. And as we've already mentioned, the park's owners are father and son scientists Sergei and Nikita Zimov, and they've been working on this project since around the mid-1990s, since Sergei was one of the first scientists to make the link between permafrost thaw and carbon dioxide release. So the strategy of the Pleistocene Park is to rewild an area of permafrost with large herbivores with a heavy tread, which will compact the permafrost, thus helping keeping it frozen, and that whilst they're grazing, and destruction of the scrubby larch forests that currently exist today will stimulate a light-coloured grassland that will reflect solar radiation back into the atmosphere. So this is an artist's rendition of what the park, what the Pleistocene ecosystem would look like, and potentially what the park may look like in the future. It currently hosts a number of animals sourced from all over the world. So there's yaks from Mongolia, reindeer from the local indigenous groups, Kalmykian cows, wild horses, musk oxen brought from a boat on Wrangel Island, sheep, herd of bison brought from Denmark, goats, and even camels. So as you mentioned, I visited the park in 2018 for the summer season, and it currently looks quite a long way from this artist's rendition. You can still see quite a lot of scrubby larch forest, dark tundra, which absorbs the solar radiation. But after 25 years, the park is showing signs of success, with the permafrost within its boundaries registering colder temperatures than the permafrost outside the park. But obviously, to have any real impact on the climate crisis, the Zimovs know that they need a network of interlinking parks. This is their ultimate goal across the permafrost landscape. But in terms of funding, they don't get anything from the Russian government, although Nikita did apply for the Russian government's Arctic business plan, in which he proposed a goat fur farm. We never had any intention of farming goat fur, but he got the grant and he got a herd of goats out of it. So The federal Yakutian government gifted a parcel of land to the Pleistocene Park, but in terms of monetary funding, they essentially have to rely on private organizations, such as the Alrosa Diamond Mining Organization, which obviously comes with its own sort of dubious ethics. Crowdfunders, they did a couple of crowdfunders which were successful, but mostly the money comes from researchers who visit the science station that Sergei set up in the 1980s, and these tend to be Western researchers from America, from Europe, and also media companies who they're sort of drawn to this like David and Goliath story of two men facing the might of the wilderness together, and I'm sure everyone on this panel has rolled their eyes a little bit at this narrative, including the Zimos themselves, but they needed to get the money. And so the future, personally, when I visited, I was quite dubious about the success of the park, and now since the invasion of Ukraine, the fact that they do rely so much on Western researchers and media companies for their funding, the future doesn't look good in my opinion. But I did ask Nikita when I was there about his so-called impossible strategy, and his answer was, it's better to start walking than to wait for death, which I think is a wonderful quote. But it's a sort of kind of hyperbole that the park's media narrative kind of relies on to attract this funding. And there's a lot of talk of saving the world and the world's best plan for this. And to my mind, it kind of feeds into a quite problematic idea of permafrost, which the Western media kind of promotes, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, the sense that permafrost is a ticking time bomb that will explode sometime in the future. And I don't really like this, this narrative, because it constructs the permafrost as a sort of homogeneous mass that is the same across the whole permafrost landscape, including North America, Arctic Europe. And it also constructs this future potential singular apocalyptic event, which to me ignores the local and ongoing permafrost events that the humans and the non-humans of Yakutia and the Russian permafrost landscape are kind of living with and responding to on a daily basis. Because yes, thawing permafrost will have and is having an impact on global climate, but I also think it's important to recognize its heterogeneity as a substance. Russian permafrost has a specific history, and Pei-Yi's work has illustrated this wonderfully, and it generates specific responses to its thawing. It cannot necessarily be compared to Canadian permafrost, for example. So I argue that we need to understand its local history and its local effects. And there's a few of these on the slide there. So in Yakutia, Sakhan farmers are already suffering from their agricultural pastures known as alas being flooded, and Susan Crate has done wonderful work on this. Indigenous reindeer herders who have already been decimated by Soviet cultural collectivization are facing even more difficulties when their reindeer are struggling to find food in the permafrost. In the towns and cities of Yakutia, including the capital city, Yakutsk, are experiencing infrastructural damages, buildings collapsing even, and obviously the horrible wildfires that Yakutia have suffered from in the past few years. And I think I read that they've started already, and it's only April, which is obviously horrific. So the so-called ticking time bomb of permafrost is already exploding in Yakutia and many other parts of the Russian Arctic. And this is what I'm trying to argue in my work, that we must account for permafrost and all of its spatial and temporal heterogeneity. And this is what I'm calling a discontinuity in my future book.
Thank you so much for this, Charlotte. And it looks like we started with a very particular example, with a very specific example of the Pleistocene Park, and as a very interesting and exciting, and I would even say avant-garde project in the area of permafrost research and also permafrost adaptation potential. But I was also interested in your thoughts on how like permafrost studies and permafrost representation is framed in a very certain way, also in media, but also maybe in popular opinion, which might not actually reflect all the various aspects of the permafrost studies and permafrost conditions, and also future of permafrost as we know it by now. So moving from this particular example and moving from this particular vision of a very specific place in the north of Yakutia, I'd like to address my next question to Pei-Yi. and going more in the area of the politics of permafrost, we basically come to an idea that politics shapes the science of permafrost, also historically and also in the present. That might not include only geopolitics and national politics, but also the politics of knowledge. So whose knowledge counts and gets heard? How do experts interact with other kinds of knowledge? And also, how do we make sense of the tensions between the global and the local when it comes to permafrost? So how do we work on both scales? How do we weigh against both scales, like the global and the local? And is the ultimate goal of preserving of permafrost is the only desirable goal, or should we be thinking more about the future of permafrost completely differently? Sorry, maybe a lot of questions in it, like in a kind of a pack of a question, but yeah, the politics of permafrost science, but also the permafrost paradoxes, global, local, whose knowledge counts, how do we work with this? What about politics of permafrost science?
Thank you so much, Angelina. Thank you so much, Charlotte. And yeah, just before launching into talking about permafrost, just want to say a few words of appreciation. I'm actually connecting to you today from the homelands of the Tongva and Serrano peoples in present-day Claremont, California. Just want to acknowledge their rights to and stewardship of the land. Really thanks to Tatiana, Masha, Lisa for organizing, and to my fellow panelists for your really wonderful work, and just so much gratitude, sympathy, and solidarity with everyone who's standing up against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I'm a historian, so instead of talking about like the future or the present now, I actually talk about the past. And I just want to emphasize, what I've looked at in my work is just how much historically political and geopolitical circumstances were a really important role in motivating the funding and establishment of permafrost science as a discipline and as a field of research. Permafrost science was actually first institutionalized in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, earlier than elsewhere in the world. So I'll just share a few slides to kind of illustrate this progression. The Academy of Sciences of the USSR established a commission to study frozen earth. It was called Вечная Мерзлота, or Eternal Frozen Earth, in 1930. It eventually became the world's first Institute for Frozen Earth Science, Institute Мерзлотоведения, in Moscow in 1939. So this was the Stalin era predecessor to today's Institute for Frozen Earth Science in Russia, which is called the Melnikov Permafrost Institute, which was established in the Khrushchev era in 1960 in Yakutsk. So the fact that the Soviet Union established this permafrost science in the 1930s was no accident. So this was the time of the 5-year plans, the start of the push to industrialize the USSR, to try to transform the country into a land of urban centers and heavy industry, to build infrastructure and extract mineral resources across the north and the east. These are just some of the locations where this party state began building infrastructure and extracting mineral resources. And so these projects encountered all kinds of problems, and I just want to illustrate some of these using some historical sources. For example, subsidence, which was when the frozen earth kind of lying underground beneath the structure was exposed to heat and it thawed, and then so the ground supporting the structure would subside. There was also something called heave, referring to the swelling of the ground during the cold months and its subsiding during the warm months. There's also something called icings, which is a kind of, or naled, a kind of winter flooding that happened when the combination of a lot of groundwater met with a lot of small outlets due to the earth being frozen, leading to a buildup of pressure in some places, causing the groundwater to burst out into the open, flood into the landscape, and quickly freeze and form all these layers of ice. And so Soviet engineers, and before them, Imperial Russian engineers, had encountered these problems when carrying out these large-scale infrastructure projects. And it was in this context that the science of permafrost was established. And so the pioneering generation of permafrost scientists in the Soviet Union were very aware of this context, and they tried to emphasize that their work was really necessary for solving the problems of socialist industrialization. And so funding for research and professional advancement all kind of related to this. And it was not just in the Soviet Union. Politics and geopolitics mattered for the establishment of permafrost science in North America as well. In the 1940s and the 1950s, when the US was building all these large-scale infrastructure projects in Alaska, including the Alaska-Canadian Highway, the Canole Pipeline, radar sites in northern Canada, known as the Distant Early Warning Line. This was during the World War II and the early Cold War. So builders in these contexts also kind of encountered the similar problems with Soviet workers and engineers. And so the US government started to translate a lot of Russian language research about permafrost that was written by Soviet scientists. And so this is how knowledge about permafrost from the Soviet Union spread to the United States, and permafrost science became established. Right. So in talking about, tensions and paradoxes and local global, I think it's important to kind of think about what we mean when we say permafrost. As Charlotte was saying, it is a very kind of discontinuous, variegated phenomenon. And moreover, when you think about the definition, this is from the International Permafrost Association's glossary of permafrost and related ground ice terms. It's defined as ground that is soil or rock and included ice organic material remaining at or below 0 degrees Celsius for 2 consecutive years. So it's a very kind of curious definition. It's ground with a negative temperature. It may be frozen or it may not be frozen. It has a name that suggests longevity, permafrost, and then it has this short-term orientation of 2 years. And so I talk about how this really quirky definition came to be. And interestingly, this technical definition includes things like man-made perennially frozen ground around or below chilled pipelines, hockey arenas, etc. And so when we talk about preserving or conserving permafrost, does it include this kind of man-made permanently frozen ground? After all, this is often chilled using energy, and if that energy is obtained from hydrocarbons, it really contributes to the emission of greenhouse gases and global warming that's causing the thawing of permafrost elsewhere. And so I think this kind of raises questions about whether the message really is kind of preserving permafrost in all its forms for its own sake, or is it about raising awareness about the Earth system as a whole, how it's interconnected to different parts of the world, with a goal not necessarily of kind of freezing in place this phenomenon that is inherently dynamic, but for kind of thinking about the connections in our planet that is necessary to sustain livelihoods. And so I just wanted to put that out there and interrogate what we mean when we say permafrost.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this, Pei-Yi. That was indeed a very profound introduction into the knowledge systems that we talk about, and also the whole global and local dimension. And also I found really exciting and very insightful your argument about what is our ultimate goal, and can we have a goal about permafrost, or do we treat permafrost as an agent on its own? We'll actually be going back to that point a bit later in our discussion. And then in the meantime, continuing from this, I would like to address a new question and to address my next question to Susan. So based on what Pei-Yi was telling about indigenous and Western knowledge, how do you see that balance? Do you see there's like a conflict between this knowledge? Western science is obviously more recent. How do you work with indigenous knowledge with permafrost studies? And also, very often now, whenever we hear about everything happening with permafrost, there are talks, well, at least there were talks also in Russia, about the need to relocate some of the communities living on permafrost. For example, Russia's presidential envoy, Ruslan Adilgeriyev, speaking in November last year, did not exclude that opportunity, that there could be a possibility that many communities will actually need to relocate from the areas where permafrost will be melting. So what's your take on that? How do you work with these topics?
Yeah, thank you, Angelina. And I also would like to first express my sincere gratitude for the creation of this panel and for including me in it. And yes, not a moment passes without thinking about my collaborators, family, friends in Russia and in Ukraine, and also the just horrific tragedies that are happening daily. So on that note, I will also share some slides to help illustrate a little bit better my points. Indigenous peoples inhabiting permafrost ecosystems have innovated ways to adapt to these ecosystems, and in the process developed a specific and empirical knowledge of permafrost and indigenous knowledge of permafrost vis-a-vis their subsistence practices. So one very clear example is how Saha need pasture and fodder for their herds, and thus they depend upon those areas. And so they develop these specific words to describe the various permafrost formations, the above ground results of the changes in the permafrost below. What is interesting, I think, is that these words are actually the lingua franca of international permafrost science today. This indigenous permafrost knowledge, like indigenous knowledge overall, is often entangled with a culture's cosmology or their understanding of how their world works. For Saha, this is an understanding that the world and all of its inhabitants, human and non-human animals, plants, rocks, water, etc., are sentient and spirit-filled. And this requires humans to conduct proper interactions with the spirits of all things as they move through the world. And Saha's belief is inextricably linked to their use of alas, which are unique ecosystems, unique to the Saha Republic, which are cryogenic lakes or lakes on permafrost, surrounded by hay fields that are bordered by taiga or boreal forest. Saha's Turkic ancestors, when they migrated north from southern Siberia in the 13th and 14th centuries, not only adapted their horse and cattle breeding culture to these fertile alas ecosystems for their fodder and hay and other resources, but they also adapted their understanding of sentience throughout these alas systems. Thereby, all interactions, all work that is done in nature, all acts of subsistence are considered interactions with the various spirits, and as such require specific rituals and observances. For example, clearing land for pasture and fields, whether it's by burning forest or draining a lake, required mediation by a shaman or another person who knew special words to appease the spirits of that place. All these practices are not ubiquitous as they were in the past. However, contemporary Saha maintain a deep understanding of alas as an important part of their cultural identity. Here are two of the many quotes from my 2017, 2018, or 2018, 2019 fieldwork interviews. And in sharp contrast, the scientific or Western knowledge of permafrost, as Pei-Yi already told us, and of alas has developed more recently and came about largely to understand how to exploit either the below ground resources, including drinking water, diamonds, gold, etc., or to work on top of the land and to build, develop infrastructure, and pursue agriculture. As thermokarst develops, and thermokarst is a technical term for what you see here on the landscape, it is basically the beginning of the deterioration and degradation of the land surface. As thermokarst develops, development proceeds and communities' lands are increasingly threatened, it's important to understand the place attachment that communities have that make them reluctant to relocate. You and I might look at this picture and say, if I lived here, I would move. It's important to understand that this is not how the people on the ground are thinking. Most have ancestral lineage in that one place on the permafrost. And so in this picture, that main area is the former airstrip for this settlement, which is no longer used for obvious reasons. And in fact, no planes land in this area. This second example of the rapid permafrost development, rapid thermokarst development is in Ulica Молодежная, which literally means street of the youth. It's an area in Cherokee where they have established for young families to have homesteads and households. And I think the question becomes, how long are those households going to be able to stay there, considering the thermokarst development? Despite the unprecedented and often dangerous changes in the land due to thermokarst development, most of these long-term communities intend to stay. There are methods to protect the permafrost in their immediate locale, but most of them are extremely time and labor intensive. In this slide, please notice the red roofed house. My collaborator and permafrost scientist at the Melnikov Permafrost Institute, Alexander Fyodorov, shares this slide with communities and explains that the reason the yard around that red roofed house shows no thermokarst development is because the members of that household clear the snow away from their yard, out of their yard as soon as it falls, so that the surface of the earth is exposed to the frigid temperatures. So it might seem counterintuitive, but in fact, the snow insulates the ground and keeps the warming happening. As you can imagine, it's a very time and labor intensive process, but it also speaks to the community's intent to stay. As thaw proceeds, it suggests that relocation is inevitable. The question becomes, can the emotional and psychological trauma of losing these places, which is synonymous to cultural history, heritage, and lineage, be intercepted so that they can be positioned rather as agents of their future in terms of finding ways to perpetuate their cultural relationship to place? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this, Susan. I also see there were quite a few questions for understanding in the chat, like what thermokarst is. So maybe if you could briefly take a look at the chat and see if you could address any of these questions, that would be really helpful. In the meantime, we proceed, and I would like to address my next question to Charlotte again. So we've heard about various forms of engagement with various actors with regard to permafrost, the scientific community, indigenous community. What about permafrost per se? Can I also speak about non-human agents in our permafrost studies? Is it at all possible to know permafrost and to try and research and study permafrost through non-human eyes?
Thanks for the question, Angelina. And again, I'm going to show a few slides. And it's a great question because I think that permafrost is so often framed, as is so much today, especially in the Anthropocene, through how humans engage with it as a substance. But I think it's really important to consider the more than human actors in the various thought forms who both live with and are constructed by the permafrost landscape in Russia. So let's start with the Pleistocene park animals. And it's important to acknowledge that these animals are placed onto the permafrost landscape with a task. Their task is to restore the prehistoric ecosystem that once existed there. So how did the Zimos reach the conclusion of how to do this? So they realized the density of animals that made up the Pleistocene ecosystem by calculating and cataloging a large number of bones, thousands upon thousands of bones that were revealed by an eroding permafrost bank called Devani Yar. This is eroded by the Kolyma River. It's not a climate change erosion, but it did reveal all of these bones, which were then catalogued by the Zimos and produced this this imaginary of what the Pleistocene Park should look like. Obviously, many of the species are now extinct, the mammoth being the obvious example, but many are not and can be rewilded, or at least a similar species can do much the same job. So these animals are tools essentially wielded by humans to perform the function of permafrost thaw mitigation. But I think it's important to acknowledge the ways in which they transgress this, the agencies that they possess, and beyond what is expected of them, essentially. And the bones that were discovered at Devani Yar kind of produce this sort of imagined utopic past in which permafrost was robust, biodiversity was abundant, and all of the problems associated with permafrost thaw today weren't really happening. But what is happening and the difficulties that the parkers are experiencing reveals a kind of subversion and agency of the animals that kind of refuse, or they don't, at least don't do as what expected of them in the context of their so-called ancestors. So for example, when I visited the park, there was the herd of horses had disappeared into the forest and hadn't been seen for weeks. This is the single bison. They've got more now, but he was obviously kind of redundant. He didn't have anyone to mate with. There were lots of problems in terms of getting the animals to mate, and obviously you need to have this successful mating in order to perpetuate the population. The climate is obviously extremely difficult for animals that are being brought from much warmer temperatures, and many of them die, and the others are having to be helped through the winter by rangers, by being given food. And Nikita's trip to Wrangel Island kind of ended in disaster when he was trying to pick up a herd of muskox, and then it turned out they were all males. So that obviously that was useless for continuing the population, and eventually they figured out how to pass through the fence and escape. So this is kind of illustrating the liveliness and the transgressiveness of the Pleistocene Park landscape, and how permafrost is configured by a more than human assemblage rather than something that is controlled by humans. But it's not just the more than humans that live on permafrost. It's also important to think about the actors that are inside or that emerge from permafrost, some of which are not necessarily alive in the normative sense of the word. And there's a couple of examples I can give on that. The first one being an incident that happened in 2016 on the Yamal Peninsula, which is the homeland of the Nenets indigenous group, who are nomadic reindeer herders. And this something that happened, it was a reindeer carcass was thawed after a particularly hot summer, and this reindeer had died from anthrax 70 years previously, but the anthrax had managed to survive because of the permafrost keeping it frozen. And when the permafrost thawed, the anthrax spores were released, infected the entire herd of reindeer, and subsequently infected the Nenet village. And very sadly, a 12-year-old boy died. The herd had to be culled and the ground had to be washed with bleach. But elsewhere on the tundra, people have begun to take advantage of a new economic opportunity that has emerged from thawing permafrost. And this is tusk hunting, you can see in the picture there. So during the summer, groups of men, and these are often indigenous men, they head deep into the tundra on the search for mammoth carcasses. And there are many, many of these mammoths who've been amazingly well preserved in permafrost, with their accompanying ivory tusks intact, which can then be sold for quite a lot of money, usually to China, where they're carved into ornaments. But also a tandem economy has emerged from this practice, which is scientists who are involved in the quite new and quite controversial science of de-extinction are on the lookout for mammoth, well-preserved mammoth bodies with their DNA that they can subsequently use to perhaps clone, or more likely to create a sort of hybrid mammoth from this DNA preserved in permafrost. And this is one of the web pages of one of the organizations involved in that. And so it might be in the future that we might see a so-called mammoth roam the tundra once more. And I think that would probably end up in the Pleistocene Park to come a full circle. So just to end on my point, it shows that there are multiple more than human actors that configure and are configured by the permafrost landscape. And I think these can help resist the sort of anthropocentrism and scientific singularity that tends to accompany permafrost knowledges. And it's also important to consider the permafrost itself as an actor and how its dynamism is illustrated. And of course, its impermanence. Permafrost is anything but permanent. And this provides the conditions for various entanglements and new more than human assemblages on the tundra. And human actors can absolutely be said to have agency. And I think it's really important when thinking about permafrost thaw mitigation strategies, such as the Pleistocene Park. This is key to resisting assumptions that permafrost and permafrost life can be controlled, essentially.
Thank you so much for this, Charlotte. It does indeed expand our view of what permafrost is and what permafrost includes, as you mentioned, like various actors from animals to ecosystems and various other non-human actors. And also, I really liked it the way you brought very particular cases of studies and also very particular stories of what was happening in permafrost and with permafrost as we know it. To continue, I would like to pose my next question to Pei-Yi, and that is, it is also something which we've touched upon already, and that is that there are various narratives about permafrost, and the scientific community very often thinks that these narratives are somewhat limited, and we only hear very particular stories about permafrost and don't hear other ones. So what's your take on this? Which narratives should be strengthened?
Oh, great. So I'm going to start again with history and kind of take us a little bit back to, what were the narratives and metaphors used about permafrost before. So, going back to the Soviet times again, when permafrost science was institutionalized as a discipline, permafrost was likened to a sentinel guarding access to treasures. This was a time when Soviet propaganda portrayed industrialization as a struggle with nature as something to be conquered. And so this was a dominant motif in Soviet propaganda. And so this rhetoric of conquest was also applied to permafrost. So I have this book here that's actually called The Conquest of the North in the region of permafrost. And in this book, Sumgin, who was one of the founders of Soviet permafrost science, along with a journalist, they talked about permafrost in terms of, humans being engaged in a struggle with it. They used anthropomorphism to talk about permafrost as a live opponent, as a phenomenon with agency that was actively thwarting industrialization. So they would say that there was hidden wealth hidden in the earth, but permafrost stood as a sentinel guarding access to treasures, and so a struggle against it has begun. And so they kind of had this dualist, almost adversarial relationship with permafrost. And today, as Charlotte's already mentioned, this idea of a time bomb is really applied sometimes to permafrost. This idea that as methane, especially, and carbon dioxide, but also methane, is released from the thawing of the frozen earth, permafrost is thawing. It's like a ticking time bomb, and like the burning of a fuse will eventually trigger an explosion. And so this is a narrative, again, in which, permafrost is this external force that is threatening humans and planetary well-being. And so, I think there are pluses and minuses to this. And on the plus side, if it increases awareness about permafrost, it kind of spurs the necessary steps that to kind of mitigate global warming, to transition to alternatives other than burning hydrocarbons for energy. I think this can be a very useful idea. On the other hand, this idea of a time bomb can inspire also apathy or despair, fatalism, perhaps, this idea that that we are certainly doomed. And so this can make individual change or social change seem kind of futile. It sort of perpetuates this idea of a dualist kind of adversarial relationship between humans and nature. And so I think that's in that kind of recapitulating that Soviet era discourse. And so I'll just stop sharing my screen now. I mean, in the book, that I use the metaphor of a living creature, like an insect transitioning through different phases and stages. I wanted to offer something that captured the dynamism of frozen earth and kind of releasing some of the adversarial and kind of hostile kind of connotations of the time bomb. I hope Susie will talk about this, because I really love the metaphor that she uses of home and homeland, and kind of tapping into kind of indigenous understandings of a loss. A loss is acknowledges frozen earth as a very dynamic phenomenon. I mean, it forms from the thawing of frozen earth, and so indigenous peoples have known the land to be dynamic and not permanent and not eternal, and they have a dynamic understanding of home. And so I kind of prefer these kinds of metaphors that might encourage us to kind of live with, be curious about, to care about permafrost, instead of thinking of it as like a time bomb or an enemy or guarding access to treasure that has to be defeated. These things that kind of echo even Soviet era metaphors. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this, Pei-Yi. I feel like it is such an important argument, and it is such an important new view of what permafrost is. Indeed, instead of this almost animal-like, enemy-like, and monster-like structure, which is going to hit us all when melting and releasing a lot of greenhouse gases into atmosphere and making climate change a complete catastrophe, your view and your idea of making it sound more like home, or making it sound more like an immediate environment, immediate surround, but also a living creature, it does bring a much more, I mean, on one side, human aspect to the permafrost, but also making then, in a way, the non-human agent like the permafrost even more important in our understanding, but also our interaction with various actors, and including ecosystems, and including various of this planet in our vision for the future, in our vision for the permafrost in particular. And with this, I would like to address my next question to Susan. And this question will be very short, and this question will be very precise. So how can we make permafrost matter?
Thank you very much. I do have to apologize ahead of time. I've got a fence going in around my yard, and of course, they're working on the part that's right outside my window. So if you hear that, I apologize. I was trying to figure out what I could do about it, but I don't think I can. And I just wanted to also mention also that when people who don't know me very well find out that I'm working on issues of permafrost, they instantly talk about methane. And I tell them, yes, that's a huge issue, but there's also hundreds of thousands of people who live on those areas. And anyway, so I think that's part of my flag that I want to wave for the public. So once again, I'm going to share my screen a little bit, because how do we make permafrost matter? I really feel like that is what I'm trying to do with my book. Even though my book is a longitudinal ethnography, which basically means ethnography done over a long period of time, which focuses on a specific culture's place attachment, and specifically to this ecosystem, this Alas ecosystem. And I look at the history of Sahas' use of the Alas, and over time how that changed, but still maintained this cultural identification with it. And I open my book with these songs, these contemporary songs that show the true longing for the Alas. And I try to convey, the power of place attachment, not just the cultural history and heritage of being in place, but of this specific ecosystem. I explore their centuries old knowledge, which I shared a little bit of that with you about permafrost and Alas. And then I show that despite the historical changes, the pre-Soviet, post-Soviet, the Soviet periods, their connection to Alas remains, as evidenced in these contemporary songs, and also in the quotes that I shared last time. And this sets the stage for me to argue that Alas for Saha is a cultural keystone. This is a specific specific cultural attachment to place. Cultural keystone is anything that plays a significant role in a culture's subsistence, their interaction with their environment. Alas plays that significant role for Saha, sense of place, cultural identity. And I detail the last several decades of permafrost thaw and how it has affected Alas. One important thing to add to this understanding of Alas, permafrost being more than this, frozen layer under the ground, quote unquote. There is a diversity of types of permafrost. There is permafrost that has no ice in it. It's solid frozen rock. Alas, the permafrost beneath the Alas is ice-filled permafrost. Hence, it is much more susceptible to the thawing that's taking place. I next take my readers to places in the world where I've also conducted research to explore how this thaw is impacting those ecosystems. For example, in Mongolia, Mongolia has permafrost. It's the most southern area of the planet with permafrost. The permafrost is patchy. It is not continuous. And it's found mostly on the northern slopes of the steppe regions of Mongolia. But it's critical to the watering of the entire steppe system, especially in the dry summer. The permafrost, quote unquote, waters those grasslands. In Labrador, Canada, communities are ice dependent for their subsistence, their travel, and their way of life in that Arctic ecosystem. So as I work through this, I'm actually talking about the cryosphere, the frozen parts of the earth, the watermen on the Chesapeake Bay, the inhabitants of Kiribati, an island in the South Pacific, are also experiencing the unprecedented thaw of the Earth's cryosphere as the sea level rises and affects them. And then in Peru, of course, the glacial melt, communities witnessing that. That's not only critical to their livelihoods in agriculture, but also is the source of drinking water for the big cities on the coastal areas of Peru. And I end my book talking about and using this phrase, we all live on permafrost, to try to bring people into the importance of permafrost. No, you can't be disinterested in permafrost, because our earth is a system that's interdependent. We don't think of permafrost, glaciers, or any other part of the cryosphere as being separated from each other. It's one system. it maintains planetary balance, and therefore we all live on permafrost. So that's basically what I try to come to through this very focused in place ethnography, and try to bring that into some relevance and importance to everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, and with this last slide that you have, we all come back to the main topic of our discussion, actually the title of our discussion, we all live on permafrost. And with this, I would like to continue our discussion with a short question, which I would like to address all of you, all our panelists, before we continue with the question and answer session. And I already see quite a few of questions in our chat, and I would welcome our participants and our listeners to write further questions in the chat or raise their hands using the raise hand function if they would like to ask a question with their voice. But before we proceed to the Q&A session, I would like to ask one question to all of the panelists. And the question would be, how do we see the future of the permafrost research? We've been privileged to have more than 30 years of relatively open access for research and collaboration, also with the Russian scientists visiting Russia, working there, cooperating on data exchange, analysis exchange, joint research projects. So now it seems like this door is closed, at least for a while. So how do we proceed from here? How do we see the future of our research? What can be done? Charlotte, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, Angelina. And this is something I've been grappling with, and I'm not sure that I have an answer, and I'm not sure any of us will be able to answer this comprehensively. But just coming from Russia, I was already feeling I wasn't working specifically on on permafrost with my latest research, but I was finding it more difficult than I had to maybe conduct research in Russia. I had an instance where the FSB were kind of following me. I had people who I was talking to, they seemed to be rather more guarded when I was trying to research Russian science. Perhaps this is just my experience, but what I imagine will happen now is just a kind of continuation of this gatekeeping, of this more insular kind of tracking of the narrative. And it's heartbreaking, really. In terms of what can be done, I mean, I'm sure we've all made a lot of close contacts with Russian scholars. I think trying to amplify their voices, particularly the indigenous scholars, and I know there are many excellent ones in Yakutia, scholars at the Melnikov Permafrost Institute, just continue to use their work and to amplify their voices. I'm not sure what the future will hold for conducting research in Russia as fieldwork, but I also know that it's more important than ever to train our eyes to try and understand what is going on, not just from a kind of geopolitical view, but also from an environmental view.
Thank you, Charlotte. Pei-Yi?
I don't think I have good answers to this question. I honestly don't know. And you know, it seems that the door has closed, but I hope that it won't be closed forever. And I guess all I can say is, you know, I think in the course of my research and also just reading all of your work, you know, it just strikes me that, you know, this vast space, I mean, not just Russia, but Eurasia, it has, you know, so many diverse, unique environments that are so important for the global system, that they, you know, they've contributed to global scientific knowledge. It's a kind of multi-ethnic and multilingual knowledge that's emerged from this space. And it has so many kind of both cautionary tales and kind of pluralism of perspectives to learn from. And so, and I hope that the door isn't closed, but I mean, at the moment, I certainly feel very pessimistic and uncertain. Yeah, I don't have an answer to this question.
Thank you, Pei-Yi, also for this somewhat pessimistic point of view and vision, which is completely understandable in current conditions. Susan?
Yeah, I was just at a gathering of academics and NGOs focused on climate change and indigenous rights in Russia, and it was organized long before the war started. So you can imagine that it changed meaning. We all realized by the time we actually got there, things had changed drastically, but very critically important to talk about it. people who were collaborating on this, who were from Russia, are now living in the United States. I reflect on it. I started working in the Baikal area, Buryatia, Tuva, Mongolia, back in the late 80s, and then up to the Saha Republic in the early 90s. And I guess what I'm mostly feeling at this point in time is what a wonderful opportunity. I mean, I just feel like, I mean, I'm not trying to say that, oh, that was fun while it lasted. That's not by any means what I'm saying. But to be able to do that work over that period of time, to collaborate with people, you know, there is that concern that the door is shut and it's going to be shut for a long time. It's hard to understand how these horrific assaults on humans can possibly, you know, change overnight into something that, oh, that was just something that happened. I mean, it's going to be a long time, I think, before things are going to get back to normal, if they're going to do that. But at this point in time, I'm maintaining contact over WhatsApp and Telegram with my collaborators in the villages where I do my research, and with my collaborators in Yakutsk with whom I do my research, and we just check in and ask how the weather is and how are things. All is well so far. So that's where I am with it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. We had quite a few questions in the chat, and I encourage further questions to be written into the chat, or please, if you want to speak with your voice, please use the raise hand function. In the meantime, if I can understand it correctly, one question was still unanswered, and that's a question about the new National Atlas of the Arctic, which appeared in Russian. And the question was whether it provided much discussion of permafrost. So I was wondering if any of the panelists were familiar with that atlas and would have anything to add. No, I see people saying no. So I'm afraid we cannot address this question at the moment. I don't see any hands, and I also don't see any further questions in the chat. So maybe it's a time now to ask our panelists whether they actually have any questions to each other, or whether they would like to address any further points which were raised by other fellow panelists, or add something, or maybe argue with something.
I just respond to something that was brought up in the chat about how this need to conquer and civilize nature sounds also like the Protestant capitalist belief. I mean, I think there's a long tradition of this kind of dualism when it comes to, you know, humans versus nature. And so it's not something that, you know, I would say was like unique to the Soviet Union at all. And so I think it's a very kind of longstanding way of thinking about things. And so I think all of our work is trying to challenge that dualism, and I think that's really what's needed. And so yeah, that's why I'm so grateful for the work that, you know, Charlotte and Susie are doing. Yeah, and Angelina too in the present.
Right. Yes. Thank you. There's also a comment in the chat now about the atlas, which is very hard to find and very expensive to buy. Well. Charlotte, Susan, do you have any further comments or reactions? Yeah.
I make an analogy in my book about the thawing of the permafrost. Maybe it's similar to Pei-Yi. You make an analogy to an insect going through some kind of metamorphosis. But I talk about how it's like a sleeping giant who's decided to turn over. And it would be very hard to get them to stop turning over. I mean, we've kind of set something in motion with the warming. And it's not, I think the ticking time bomb idea is very misleading. I believe that, you know, as other speakers have said, that we need to think of this more as, yes, human activities are warming the planet. Yes, permafrost is thawing. We're losing glaciers. Cryosphere is transforming. But I think if we think of it in these very defined sort of explosion, tipping point, this kinds of things, we're losing, as others have said, our own agency, right, to actually contribute to how we're going to go forward. I don't think that we're ever going to go back to something that we had before. I think it's the same if we think of our discussion about what's going on in Russia. We're not going to go back to how it was before. We're not going to go back to how the planet was before. Everything is changing. And I think what we're doing, what we're trying to contribute is to a raising of an awareness of what is this thing called permafrost? Who lives on it? How are they doing that? You know, this idea of being at home on permafrost is foreign to most of us because we don't live there, but it is the closest thing to home to the people who live there. So how can we articulate that in a way that we can get people's attention and get them to buy into it and understand? I think that, to me, is a big part of what at least I'm trying to do.
Thank you, Susan. We have another question in the chat in the meantime. Are there scientists or resource managers who are working on permafrost protection in northern Mongolia? With climate change and the drying out of the Gobi and associated steppe landscape, I would think there would be an important recognition of this problem. Would anyone have any comment on that? On northern Mongolia?
Is that a question?
Yeah, that was a question, yeah.
Could you restate the question of that?
Sorry, so the question was, are there scientists or resource managers working on permafrost protection in northern Mongolia?
Well, I mean, I've worked in northern Mongolia. I actually went with a group that specifically was looking at the permafrost issues of Mongolia. I know that the desert is expanding because of the issue of the dwindling patchy permafrost in Mongolia. I do not personally know of anyone who's working on that. And to be quite frank, I don't know exactly how they would work on that if they were. Matthias was on here earlier. I don't think I see him here anymore. He actually worked with us on that project. So yeah, they do have monitors going from southern Mongolia up to northern Mongolia, so they're able to track the changes and the transformations in that patchy permafrost over a period of time.
Thank you for this, Susan. Charlotte, I think you didn't, as of now, you didn't have this statement about the the remarks of other panelists, and I was wondering if you would like to add or address anything before we'll be wrapping up the panel.
Yeah, and just to kind of move on from the question that Susan just answered, I think it's a really important question when we think about permafrost thaw mitigation schemes like the Permafrost Park and potentially one happening in northern Mongolia. There's kind of like question that emerges from a geoengineering strategy, which is essentially what it is. It's kind of a terraforming scheme to attempt to protect permafrost. But what sort of tensions arise with this sort of thing? And I think this is quite stark with Susan's work on Indigenous communities and culture. Who gets to decide what is of value in terms of permafrost? And in terms of the Pleistocene Park, I'm a big fan of the project, but in terms of kind of canvassing opinion of local people, local Indigenous groups, there hasn't really been any, and I know there have been tensions with the locals who've just kind of had a complete, you know, what's going on here? Why am I not allowed to shoot these animals and eat them? Because this is, you know, this is what I do in the tundra. So I think it's really important to kind of question the motivations and indeed the effects of schemes like these. I mean, what would happen if there was a successful kind of network of Pleistocene ecosystems across the permafrost landscape? It would be chaotic in a sense. So I think it's really important to address this kind of the tensions and also the heterogeneity of living with permafrost.
Thank you, Charlotte. In the meantime, we have like the panel's almost out of time, but we have a few questions in the chat, and maybe we can address them like really briefly and precisely. Is there any trends bearing cooperation on the subject of permafrost between the researchers in Alaska and the Chukotsky Autonomous Region or Kamchatka?
I mean, I'll just mention that talking about barriers to science, I mean, there were many Soviet scientists who left the Soviet Union and then going to work in the United States, permafrost scientists, including in Alaska, very famously, Vladimir Romanovsky, for example. And so, there are ties between kind of Russian American researchers and Russian researchers today, through that kind of historical development as well.
And also I'll say, I see a few people who are on here who are involved in a large international project, Nunataryak, which is a huge international project that's working in many Arctic countries, specifically working on communities in permafrost. It's both natural and social science researchers. So not maybe specifically across the Bering Sea, but you could say that that's happening there too.
Thank you, Susan. One final question we have in the chat is addressed to Susan, to you. Where are or were the issues caused by permafrost thaw on the list of priorities for local residents in the areas of Yakutia where you worked?
Well, my last, my 2018-2019 field work, and I also must say, I think back how fortunate I was to kind of run in under the closing curtain, pardon the pun, and be able to do that research, because after that, I have not been able to go back, and now I'm not sure when. So in the 18-19 field research, people in 5 or 6 years' time became incredibly aware of the thawing permafrost. And I think a lot of it had to do with their own observations of the outlying areas when they go out to hunt, when they go out to hay, looking at the landscapes changing, but also because Alexander Fyodorov and other permafrost scientists have made an effort to try to bring this information into the press. There are numerous newspaper articles helping people to understand what this change is. So it was pretty high on people's concerns, people talking about going to places that they've been going to for all their lives. And suddenly the ground is opening up and there's a lake forming. Yeah, so I didn't prioritize it, but my experience was it was definitely on everyone's radar.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you also for bringing this very direct on the ground knowledge from your experience of working in Yakutia and also many other regions of Russia. Indeed, so we don't know when such kind of cooperation and research projects will become ever possible again. We can only hope that it will not take that long for the political and also scientific situation to change and to change for the best. In the meantime, our discussion is coming to an end, and I would like to thank all the panelists, Susan, Charlotte, and Pei-Yi, for being with us, for presenting your knowledge, your expertise, and sharing your stories about the permafrost studies, your trips to the permafrost areas, your experience of interaction with people directly affected by the permafrost, and for building a new vision for us all, a new vision of the permafrost, not a scary monster, but rather as a living being and non-human actor, which however has also very human abilities and something which we can feel, something that we can relate to, and something that we can look at with different eyes. I'd also like to thank the organizers from the Russian Studies Workshop, Indiana University, Tatiana, Lisa, and Sarah. Thank you so much for bringing this panel together. And on my side, I would like to say that Even though we all live through such difficult conditions, it is important, as we do now, to continue conversations also on such issues as climate change, as permafrost, to try and see beyond the current horizon of the war conditions and of the conditions of Russia invading Ukraine and all consequences, which also two panelists and this panel have experienced in our personal lives. And I do hope to continue this conversation, and I do hope for peace to come very soon. And I do hope to see the new future, which will be possible beyond the current war conditions and the current critical conditions which affect life of millions of people at the moment. Thank you.
And I want to thank you, Angelina. You did an excellent job moderating and herding us three cats.
Thank you so much, Angelina, and thank you for everyone for coming.